She said I was too handsome to pay rent with money. I laughed, but deep down, I knew she wasn't entirely joking. I still remember the first night it happened. I had come home late from my shift at the cafe, exhausted and barely holding on to the little energy I had left. My shoes were damp from the drizzle outside, and my shoulders ached from carrying too many trays. When I unlocked the apartment door, I was already planning how quickly I could collapse onto my bed. But she was there, my landlady. She stood in the hallway, dressed in a simple silk blouse that shimmered softly under the warm light, her dark hair loosely tied back. At 42, she carried herself with a kind of effortless grace that always unsettled me, not because she tried too hard, but because she didn't need to. She smiled when she saw me, a smile that had just enough mischief in it to make my chest tighten. "You know," she said, leaning casually against the wall, "you're far too handsome to be paying rent with money." I froze, the words landing somewhere between a joke and a dare. My first instinct was to laugh, and I did, awkwardly, rubbing the back of my neck. "Well, unfortunately, that's all I've got," I managed to say, trying to sound casual. Her eyes lingered on mine a little too long before she chuckled softly, waving her hand as if brushing it off. "Relax, I was teasing," she said, though her voice carried that faint, lingering seriousness, the kind that makes you wonder what part of the joke wasn't a joke at all. The hallway felt suddenly smaller. The faint scent of her perfume, something warm and floral, wrapped around me, and I caught myself wondering what exactly she meant. Was it truly just humor? Or was there something she wasn't saying out loud? I nodded quickly, pretending not to notice the way my heartbeat had picked up. "Good night," I said, slipping into my apartment faster than I probably should have. But as I closed the door, her words stayed with me, echoing in the quiet. "Too handsome to pay rent with money." I told myself not to overthink it. She was my landlady, confident, witty, and far more experienced than me. Why would she mean anything by it? Still, lying in bed later that night, I couldn't shake the image of her leaning in the doorway, that half-smile tugging at her lips, her eyes holding mine just a little too long. And that's when it began, a thought, a curiosity, a spark I hadn't expected. Something told me this was only the beginning of a story I couldn't have prepared for. The days that followed should have felt normal, but they didn't. After that strange, not joking remark about my rent, I found myself noticing her in ways I hadn't before. Noticing how her heels clicked softly across the wooden floor when she passed by. Noticing the faint trace of her perfume drifting through the hallway, lingering long after she'd gone. Noticing the way her laugh, low and rich, seemed to echo long after it faded. I told myself I was being foolish, reading too much into something harmless. But then small things began to change. She lingered a little longer when we spoke. She would ask about my day with a sincerity that felt rare, as though she actually wanted to know, not just filling silence. Sometimes, when she handed me the mail, her fingers brushed against mine, just lightly, but enough to make me pause, to feel a spark travel through my skin before either of us pulled away. Late one evening, after I'd come home from class, she called out as I was unlocking my door. "Tea?" she asked, holding up a mug as if she already knew the answer. I hesitated, but the warmth in her eyes left me little room to refuse. And so it became a quiet ritual, late-night tea in her kitchen. Her kitchen always carried this glow, golden light spilling across the counters, soft shadows pooling in the corners. She would pour steaming cups, and we'd sit across from each other at the small round table. She told me stories of her younger years, of mistakes she regretted and dreams she still carried. And I, for reasons I couldn't explain, found myself opening up too. It was strange how easy it felt, sitting there with her. Strange how silence didn't feel heavy or awkward, but comforting. Yet, beneath the comfort, there was tension. Always. Her hand resting on the table just close enough that mine twitched with the temptation to reach out. The soft lines near her eyes when she smiled, the way she sometimes looked at me as though she were about to say something she shouldn't. I caught myself memorizing those moments. The way the steam curled up from her mug, fogging the air between us. The way her lips curved around words. The way her presence filled the room, leaving me restless long after I returned to my apartment. It was nothing more than tea, nothing more than conversation. But it was also everything more. And though neither of us acknowledged it, we both felt it, that invisible thread pulling tighter every night. The storm came suddenly that night. Sheets of rain lashed against the windows, and thunder rolled through the sky like the growl of something ancient. I had just finished an essay when the lights flickered once, then died completely, plunging my apartment into darkness. I stood there for a moment, listening to the rain hammering the roof, when I heard a soft knock on my door. It was her. My landlady. She held a small box of candles in her hand, her blouse clinging slightly from the damp air, strands of her dark hair loose against her cheeks. "Power's out for the whole block," she said, her voice calm, though her eyes carried a tired heaviness. "I thought you might need these." I thanked her, and before I could even think, I followed her back into her apartment. It felt warmer there, though the only light came from a cluster of candles she'd arranged on the kitchen table. Their flames painted the walls in shifting gold, and the shadows softened her features in a way that made her look both younger and more fragile. We sat down, mugs of tea cradled in our hands. At first, it was the usual, small talk about the storm, complaints about the unreliable wiring in the building. But then, as the rain pounded harder against the windows, something shifted. She grew quiet, staring at the candle flame as if it carried all the answers she'd been avoiding. And then she spoke. Her voice trembled, just slightly. She told me about her divorce, not in detail, but in fragments, each piece carrying the weight of a wound still healing. She admitted how silence filled her home in ways she couldn't always bear, how sometimes she left the TV on at night just to feel less alone. I didn't know what to say. I wasn't used to seeing her this way, stripped of her usual confidence, her laughter replaced by raw honesty. All I could do was sit with her, listening, letting her words settle between us. At one point, her hand brushed against mine on the table. For a moment, she didn't pull away. Neither did I. Her skin was warm, soft, and the simple contact sent something electric through me. She exhaled slowly, as if the weight of her confession had lifted just enough for her to breathe again. We didn't say much after that. We didn't need to. The storm outside raged on, but in that quiet, flickering room, something had shifted between us, something fragile, unspoken, but impossible to ignore. The storm had passed by morning, but the building bore its scars. A window in the hallway had leaked during the night, leaving streaks of water pooling along the sill. She asked if I could help her patch it up until a repairman came. I told myself it was nothing, just lending a hand, but my chest tightened as soon as I stepped into her apartment again. The window sat high above the counter, half open, the frame swollen from the rain. I climbed onto a stool while she stood nearby, handing me tools. "Careful," she said softly, her voice warmer than usual, carrying that protective note I'd only ever heard in fragments. I reached forward, struggling with the stubborn latch, when I felt her hand on my arm. Light, steady, almost accidental. But she didn't pull away. Her fingers lingered, cool at first, then warming against my skin. I turned slightly, glancing down at her. Her eyes lifted to mine, not teasing, not guarded, but vulnerable. Searching. For what, I couldn't tell. Permission? Reassurance? I froze, caught between instinct and hesitation. The closeness was overwhelming, the faint rise and fall of her breath, the scent of her perfume curling into the air between us, the way her face tilted upward as though gravity itself had drawn her toward me. I didn't move. Neither did she. But the air around us thickened, charged like the moments before lightning strikes. My heart pounded so loud I was certain she could hear it. And then, as if realizing she'd crossed an invisible line, she withdrew her hand. She laughed quietly, brushing it off. "Sorry. I just didn't want you to lose your balance." But the damage was done. Or maybe it wasn't damage at all. Maybe it was something else entirely, something awakening. Because even after she stepped back, the ghost of her touch remained. We finished the repair in silence, though silence didn't feel like silence anymore. It felt like a conversation we weren't ready to have. Every movement seemed heavier, more deliberate. When I finally stepped down from the stool, our shoulders brushed. She murmured a soft, "Thank you," her voice barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of something unspoken. That night, lying in bed, I replayed it all again and again. The warmth of her hand, the way her gaze had lingered, the way the air had stilled around us as if the world itself had paused to watch. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, that she didn't mean it the way I thought she did. But deep down, I knew. Something had shifted. A boundary had been brushed, not broken, but the memory of it pulsed like a heartbeat. It was no longer just jokes in hallways or cups of tea by candlelight. It was intimacy. Real, unspoken, undeniable. And it scared me just as much as it thrilled me. She invited me to dinner one evening. Nothing extravagant, just pasta and a bottle of red wine, but it felt different, heavier, as though we'd both silently agreed to step into new territory. The kitchen was warm, the scent of garlic and herbs clinging to the air, soft music humming in the background. She moved gracefully around the space, every gesture deliberate yet unforced. I watched her as she stirred the sauce, her blouse sleeves rolled to her elbows, her hair falling loose around her shoulders. There was something disarming about seeing her this way, not the composed landlady who managed everything, but simply a woman, relaxed in her own home. We sat across from each other, bowls steaming, glasses half full. At first, conversation flowed easily, her stories about work, my half-joking complaints about classes. We laughed, and for a while, it almost felt ordinary. Almost. Because beneath the laughter, I couldn't ignore the pulse of tension threading between us. Then it happened. She leaned across the table, eyes narrowing playfully. "You've got something right here," she said softly, her hand reaching for me before I could react. Her thumb brushed the corner of my lip, slow and careful, wiping away a trace of sauce. The world stopped. Her touch was barely there, but it sent a wave of heat rushing through me. I didn't move. I couldn't. My eyes lifted to hers, and in that moment, everything unsaid swelled between us. Almost without thinking, I caught her hand in mine. My fingers wrapped gently around hers, holding it still. Her skin was warm, delicate, trembling faintly beneath my touch. She didn't pull away, not at first. Instead, she stared back at me, her breath catching ever so slightly. It couldn't have been more than a second, maybe two, but it felt endless. Then she laughed, soft, nervous, unlike her usual confidence. "I forgot myself," she murmured, slipping her hand back, her eyes darting away. But the damage was done. Or maybe it was more than that. Because I saw the truth in her expression, the conflict she carried, the way she fought herself just as much as I did. The rest of the meal passed quietly. We both smiled, we both spoke, but neither of us mentioned what had happened. We didn't need to. Something had shifted again, another boundary crossed, another line blurred. And I knew, she knew, there was no going back. It was late when I returned from the grocery store, arms weighed down with bags that felt heavier than they should have. The hallway was quiet, the kind of stillness that comes after midnight when the world finally gives in to sleep. I had barely made it to my door when hers opened. "Need a hand?" she asked softly. Before I could answer, she stepped forward, taking 2 bags from me without waiting for permission. I followed her into her apartment, the air immediately warmer, scented faintly with lavender and something sweet I couldn't quite name. She set the groceries on the counter and exhaled as though the weight wasn't just in her arms but in her chest. "Thank you," I said, though the words felt small. She stood by the counter, her hands resting against the edge, her shoulders tense. For a moment, I thought she would make one of her usual witty remarks, some clever line to dissolve the silence. But she didn't. She just stood there, lips parted, as if weighing whether or not to speak. Then, finally, she did. "I shouldn't say this," she whispered, her voice trembling with a vulnerability I had never heard from her before, "but you make me feel alive again." The word struck me like lightning, sharp and undeniable. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. She wouldn't look at me. Her eyes stayed fixed on the counter, her hand trembling slightly as she gripped the wood. I stepped closer without meaning to, as if drawn by some invisible force. The distance between us shrank until I could feel the heat of her body, until I could see the rise and fall of her chest, quick and unsteady. Gently, I placed my hand over hers. "You don't have to explain," I said quietly, though my own voice betrayed me with its shake. Her eyes lifted then, finally meeting mine. For a heartbeat, the room was silent. The world itself seemed to pause. And then, with the faintest, most fragile movement, she leaned toward me. Not all the way, just enough that her forehead came to rest against my chest. My heart hammered beneath her touch. I didn't move. I didn't dare. I just let her stay there, let her breathe, let her unspoken confession settle between us. The weight of her loneliness, the risk of her honesty, the quiet courage it had taken to admit even that much, I felt it all. Her hand slipped into mine, fingers hesitant but seeking. I held on, steady, not to pull her closer, but simply to let her know I wasn't letting go. We didn't kiss. We didn't need to. That moment, that fragile closeness, said more than words ever could. And as I stood there with her, feeling the warmth of her leaning against me, I realized something I couldn't ignore anymore. This wasn't just attraction. It was connection. Real, undeniable, and terrifying in its intensity. After that night, nothing between us felt the same. We didn't speak of her confession again, but it hung in the air, not as a burden, but as a truth we both quietly carried. The walls that once kept us apart had thinned, and every glance, every touch, every silence seemed to breathe with new meaning. One evening, she invited me over for dinner again. But this time, it wasn't formal or careful. It was casual, mismatched aprons, a cluttered counter full of vegetables and herbs, laughter spilling freely as we cooked side by side. I chopped onions while she stirred a simmering pot, and every so often, our hands brushed when we reached for the same knife or spice jar. Those tiny collisions felt deliberate, even when they weren't, and each one left my chest warm. There was no tension tonight, no hesitation. Just comfort, as though we had both decided that whatever this was, we would stop fighting it. At one point, she leaned across me to grab a spoon, her shoulder brushing mine. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let herself linger, her cheek almost grazing my arm, her lips curving into a soft smile as though to say, "I don't need to hide anymore." Later, after we'd eaten, we settled on the couch with mugs of tea. She curled her legs beneath her, and I stretched an arm across the back of the sofa, not quite touching her, but close. Slowly, she leaned in, resting her head lightly against my shoulder. The weight of it was delicate, yet grounding, like she had finally allowed herself to let go. For a while, we said nothing. The room was quiet except for the hum of the old refrigerator and the occasional creak of the building settling. And in that silence, I realized something. This wasn't a fleeting attraction or a secret thrill. This was belonging. I didn't just want a place to live. I wanted a place in her life. She shifted slightly, her hand brushing mine on the cushion. Without thinking, I turned my palm upward, and she slipped her fingers into mine. Her grip was gentle but sure, like a promise. In that moment, everything else, the whispers of what people might say, the doubts about age, the lines we had once been afraid to cross, faded. All that remained was us. And as I sat there with her, her head resting against me, her fingers entwined with mine, I understood something simple and undeniable. Sometimes love doesn't arrive the way you expect it. It finds you in quiet kitchens, in stormy nights, in the laughter that lingers too long. And if you're brave enough to hold on, it can change everything.